All right, good afternoon, everyone. My colleagues hear me, give me a thumbs up. All right. Welcome to the University of Pittsburgh Center on Race and Social Problems, our CRISP cast. We're very excited to have you today to talk about a very important topic. And good afternoon, everyone. My colleagues hear me, give me a thumbs up. I think I'm all right. All right, we've got an echo there. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. All right. We bring greetings on behalf of the Chancellor, on behalf of the Provost, on behalf of our Dean at the School of Social Work, and we're excited to have you here today for a very important topic. We've been having a series on race and COVID, and we disrupted that series to focus on a longstanding problem in the U.S., and that's race and policing. It's been a harrowing couple of weeks, especially for African Americans, and so I want to just first off acknowledge what we have been going through. I'm in that group, and just send our best to everyone that's been dealing with this on a personal level. I want to acknowledge the shutdown academia, shutdown STEM crowd that's here with us today. This event, technically Dr. Wallace and I should have, this day shouldn't give us a respite, but we already had this event scheduled. And it's a time for people to learn more about the work we're doing and the work that is happening in racial justice and put down the daily comings and goings in other academic disciplines. So thank you for joining us today. So we've had our head on a swivel in Black America. We've lost Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and literally thousands of others in the history of this country. Race, civilian deaths, policing is a hot topic, and we have a special podcast today to address that. A couple of housekeeping pieces before we get into the content today. There are continuing education credits for this talk. You will get a follow-up email that will have a survey where you can access those. The talk is full. It is full on the webinar. If you have colleagues that are trying to get in, the easiest thing to do is to go to crsp.pitt.edu, and the link to the YouTube simulcast is there. That's crsp.pitt.edu. Otherwise, we are posting the link also in the chat. So take a look at that and make sure everyone has it. You can go to any of our social media outlets and get it. You can send your questions today in the chat for Dr. Harris and in the YouTube comments. And the lecture, as always, is recorded, so you will be able to access this in a couple of days on crisp.pitt.edu. So with that said, with no further ado, I want to introduce Dr. John Wallace, our Senior Faculty Fellow at the Center for Research and Community Engagement, who will introduce the speaker. Dr. Wallace, how are you today?
I'm excellent and getting better. Jay, how are you?
I'm the same way.
Right. Super excited about our topic today, and of course about our speaker. We've been wrestling with some very tough times over the last few weeks, and so the opportunity to have David Harris here is an honor and a privilege, and we think that this is going to be a tremendous time of understanding and insight. David is the Sally Ann Semenko Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh's Law School, where he teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence, and other courses. Professor Harris devotes his research and teaching to the study of police conduct, search and seizure law, and the intersection of race and criminal justice. He's the leading national authority on racial profiling. His 2002 book, Profiles in Injustice, and his many scholarly articles on the topic resulted in new laws and regulations in hundreds of American police departments. David is also the creator and the host of the Criminal Injustice podcast. I've listened to it myself, strongly recommend it. And that podcast is, since 2016, that podcast has been devoted to interviews with justice system actors, advocates, journalists, and many others, and the news analysis and commentary on the most difficult problems in the criminal justice system. In Pittsburgh and in other communities around the country, David has applied his work to creating relationships between police and communities they serve, particularly African-American communities. And the goal is to bring about more respectful, just policing and public safety. This work has resulted in David receiving the Jefferson Award for Public Service in 2015. Today, he's going to talk about race, police, and unarmed civilian deaths. What can be done? His remarks are based on the work that he did to write his latest book, A City Divided, Race, Fear, and the Law in Public Confrontations, published this year by Anthem Press. It tells the story of a terrible incident between police and civilian violence in Pittsburgh, and the case's full journey through the legal system. The case, as you may know, is Jordan Miles. The event described actually happens on Tioga Street, the street in which I was born and raised. And so this work is particularly important to me. The story is one that addresses the challenge, the full journey of the case through the system, and it doesn't stop there. And that's why we actually have created the crsp. It tells us not just what happened, but why. And why these incidents of violence between police and civilians happen, particularly among Black Americans, and why they keep happening all over the country. And so we believe that the timing for this couldn't be better. We're excited to have David Harris to teach us, to lead us, and have a conversation around the important issue around race, police, and the killing of civilians. Welcome, David.
Thank you ever so much, John, and Dr. Hughley too, and the entire center. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to be with you today. You know, this is a very, very difficult time. I think we all know that. Like many of you, I imagine you have begun a meeting like this in the recent past with a moment of silence in memory of George Floyd. I want to do something, but I want to do something different because I'm not inclined to silence right now. I want to say his name, George Floyd. But as I say his name, I have to say the name of Breonna Taylor. I have to say the name Ahmaud Arbery. I have to say Laquan McDonald in Chicago. I have to say Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, and Eric Garner in Staten Island, and Tamir Rice in Cleveland, and John Kelly here in Pittsburgh, and Stephon Clark in Sacramento, Jamar Clark in Minneapolis several years ago. I have to say Sam DuBose from Cincinnati, and Botham Jean in Texas. And I have to say Trayvon Martin's name. And here in Pittsburgh, we can go further back than that, can't we? I have to say Johnny Gamage's name, and I have to say Jerry Jackson's name. The list is literally too long to finish and too horrible to contemplate. And I think that's why we're here. So I'm going to try to take these few minutes, I'm very grateful for them, to give you a sense of how I see the scope of the problem, why this keeps happening, which, as I said, and as John said, is at the center of my book, A City Divided, and then try to end with some concrete suggestions about what can be done. So let's begin with the idea of the scope of the problem. This is always where we begin when we want to get our arms around something. Fatal police shootings. What do we know? Well, at least as interesting a question of what we know is how we know it. And you'd think that the source for something like this would be the federal government, the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They're going to have a handle on this. Well, they don't. They keep very little data on this because they can't force local police departments to give that data to them up to the federal level. It's something that former Attorney General Eric Holder called a disgrace, and it's hard to disagree. So the source for our data actually comes from media. The Washington Post and the Guardian actually began tracking fatal police shootings in 2015 after the events in Ferguson. And they are the best and still only sources for this. The federal government has not, unfortunately, improved. How is that data gathered? It comes from news reports, social media postings, and police reports. All of this has given us a fairly robust source on these things. year in and year out since they started to track it. When law enforcement does submit statistics on fatal police shootings to the FBI, to other parts of the federal government, it has underreported, usually by more than half when we compare it to the other data that is out there. So that's our source, and we're going to use the Washington Post data. It lines up very well with the Guardian data. Here's a graph to take a look at. This shows roughly how many fatal police shootings occur in the United States per year. This has a line for each of the years since 2015. You see the 2020 line in orange is about halfway up now, since we're about halfway through the year. And year in and year out, we're at about 1,000 fatal police shootings per year. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. We don't see this varying a lot. It's been here since these data were begun to be kept just a few years back. Let's drill down a little bit to get an answer to what I think is the obvious next question. How are these deaths distributed? And I want to make clear that despite the title of today's talk, we are talking about both armed and unarmed civilians shot and killed by police. That's how these data are collected. You can go into the fatal force feature on Washington Post. I did it earlier today. There's one for each year. They update this year's every single day, and you can break it down by armed and unarmed and so forth. What about race, though? What do we know about race and fatal police shootings? Well, what we see is well represented by this graph. When you take the raw numbers and you compare them to population, so you get a population rate, blacks are shot by police, fatally shot by police, at roughly 31 per million population, whereas with whites, it's about 13 per million population. So blacks shot and killed by police at roughly twice the rate and a little bit more than whites. You can see Hispanics somewhere between at 23 per million killed in this period where this has been measured. So what can we tell from all of these data, from the facts that we have? Number one, the problem is definitely more visible, and I think that gives people the impression that it's getting worse, but there's no evidence of that. It seems actually in kind of steady state. We have 4.5 years worth of data, and it doesn't change a lot. Like I said, 1,000 more or less per year. But the flip side of that coin is that it's also not getting any better, right? It's not really changing in the direction we would all like it to. It's not going down. It's kind of holding steady, despite all of the reforms and so forth that we have, I'm sure, heard about in the time since 2015. And then there's this, of course, as I just said, blacks are dying at more than twice the rate of whites in fatal police shootings. But there's more I want to say about this, because this surely understates the overall problem. What the Washington Post and the Guardian are doing great service by gathering information on fatal police shootings, but they are not capturing all the data, even on the overall use of force by police. And that really should be the universe for us. I mean, here's what's not captured, just to hit on a few points. Use of deadly force that doesn't involve firearms, all right? So that police officer who killed George Floyd by kneeling on his neck, that wouldn't show up in these data. Wouldn't show up. It's not captured there. Only fatal shootings. Use of deadly force by firearms or other that doesn't kill is not captured either. So a police officer, and remember, we're talking about police officers. They are the literal embodiment of the state and the state's power, trying to take the life of a citizen. Maybe justified under the law, maybe not, but that's the essence of the transaction. That's what's happening. And so we should even know how many times they fire and miss or fire and wound. Those are equally important. And none of the data we have captures the use of non-deadly, or as it's sometimes called, less lethal force. That would include, under Minneapolis police policy, the neck pressure holds and tasers and other kinds of, quote, non-lethal force. So none of this is there. None of this is there. And so what we know probably understates the overall picture on police use of force. let's push a little deeper now into the question of how race impacts this, because we do have some good data on that. If we look at all uses of force, here's what we see. And since the center of the world for these issues has been Minneapolis over the last couple of weeks, no better time to go there. This is a graph that came from some work by the New York Times. And what you see year in and year out in this graph is how police use all types of force. And Black people in the purple colored bars, they are 59% of the folks on the receiving end of use of force by police in Minneapolis, though they are much less in terms of population. All others, 41%, coming to bring us to the conclusion that Blacks are 7 times more likely to have force used on them than whites are in Minneapolis. And this is, like I said, all kinds of use of force. And the next graph does illustrate that particular point. You see it broken out by types of use of force. Displaying a gun, pointing a gun at somebody, chemical irritants like pepper spray or pepper balls, neck restraints, improvised weapons, trained canines, and so forth. And Blacks are never less than 56% of all targets of use of force, and they are as much as 68% of all those who get guns pointed at them. And that's all considered various types of uses of force. Now, some of the data here, I just want to say for purposes of being clear, some incidents feature more than one type of use of force. So that's always an issue when we look at something like this. So the overall picture here, what are we looking at? When we talk about use of force or use of deadly force, it is not getting worse, but it's certainly not getting better. And there is a definite racial skew in how police are using deadly force in the Washington Post data and all kinds of force in the representative data from Minneapolis. There's no reason to believe that Minneapolis is a lot better or a lot worse than most other cities of its size. So if that's what the problem looks like, where does it come from? Why does this happen? And as I said, this is really the centerpiece of the story in A City Divided. Because if we can understand why it happens, we have a chance at working toward doing something about it. Unless we know why it happens, we're stuck, right? So why does it happen? I would single out these 2 important issues. It's the twin toxins of race and fear. These 2 things, either one separately, but mixed together, this results in incidents that shouldn't be violent becoming violent, and those that are violent becoming lethal. I'm going to show you just a little bit of the science on this. There's a lot more in the book, but let me show you little bits of it. Let's talk about race first. We've known for years, reading the sociology literature, social work literature, you name it, that the dominant American stereotypes of Blacks, but particularly Black men, those stereotypes are that Black men are dangerous, they're criminal, they're violent, and that pervades the population. All types of people hold those stereotypes and sometimes have implicit biases that are just like that. But in the last 20 years, social psychology has really blazed a new path in terms of showing us new work that has exposed just exactly what this means in some really startling ways. I'm going to show you just 2 examples of this work. This piece of work, really a landmark in my opinion, Seeing Black, Race, Crime, and Visual Processing. This is by Jennifer Eberhardt, Stanford MacArthur winner, Philip Atiba Goff, Center for Policing Equity, and John Jay College, and some of their colleagues. What they did was they used some standard techniques, particularly the technique of priming experimental subjects. They would show them a quick visual image and prime them, and then do the experiment on the subjects. And the subjects could be all races, all ages, either any other group. And so they would show them primes, sometimes of a Black person's face, sometimes a white person's face, and sometimes no face at all, no prime at all. What were the results? Let me just show you one piece of this. They showed that they did the priming, and then they showed them a series of 41 images, degraded visual fields. They look like this. There were 41 of these. Now you can see by looking at frame 41, there's a weapon in the background. So it's not a fair test for us, but if you looked at frame 1, you would see like a fuzzy thing like the old TVs when it was between channels, and something is barely visible in there. And they would just show one slide after the other to the experimental subject. What they found was that when they primed people with the face of a black person, as opposed to a white person or no priming at all, the person much more readily, much more quickly within this series of slides recognizes a weapon. Here it's a gun, it could be other things too. So the visual processing of the human being is actually changed by seeing a black person's face to more readily recognize instruments of crime and violence. They did other versions of this same experiment as part of this study. They would, for instance, show images of guns or other weapons as their primes, and then they would show a photo of a group of people, mixed races. And people shown the primes of weapons, their eyes would go directly to the black faces. People shown primes of other things, they would be much more generally directed into the groups of people. So in the words of Eberhardt and Goff and their colleagues, blackness is a, quote, visual tuning device for Americans. Think about that. It tunes the visual system and the brain. Now think about how that would impact an interaction between a police officer and a person of color. Here's another one I want to just quickly talk to you about: the essence of innocence, consequences of dehumanizing black children. This was done by Goff and different set of colleagues. The bottom line in this study is that when people view pictures of black children, they describe them as older, larger, more muscular, more dangerous, more threatening than pictures of white children. Do you recognize this person? This is 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who, as I said earlier, was killed in Cleveland by a police officer. Tamir Rice was described by the police officer who killed him in the police officer's report this way. Here's some language from a Washington Post article. Officer Lohman, who fired the shots, he appeared to be over 18 years old and 185 pounds, both of which were vast overestimates, right? 12 years old. Prosecutors, even weeks later, were still describing Tamir with that same set of tropes. He was big for his age, wore a big jacket and 36 pants, could have easily passed for someone much older. So the science on this is devastating. It really is. What about that other toxin of race, the twin of race, the toxin of fear? Well, this is also playing a huge role in all of these confrontations and in amping them up. And for fear, fear is on both sides of the interaction, all right? I think you probably could have anticipated I would talk about the fear that people of color, particularly black people, feel when facing a police officer. But fear is part of the life and thinking and feeling of police officers too. Now, I want to be clear about this. I am not saying that police officers are not brave and courageous. They exhibit physical courage all the time. Former President Obama, I think, said it best. He said, police officers are the people who run towards the danger when the rest of us are running away. And I think that's true. Many of them are quite brave in ways that I wouldn't be, right? But the presence of bravery and courage does not mean an absence of fear. And fear is very much part of police training and culture today. Police are training in a certain way to try to overcome that. And that's what I want to describe, because I think it actually does the opposite. This is the cover of a book called On Combat. It's written by a fellow named Dave Grossman and his co-writer. It is widely read in law enforcement circles. It is widely used in law enforcement training, particularly private training. There's a whole industry of private training out there for officers who are already in the field, seminars, all kinds of things Grossman's training for years was called the warrior police officer training or warrior training or warrior on the street, things like that. And the idea of being a warrior is simply this. There's a war going on out there and police are the front line. There's a war out there and we police officers, we're the ones who have to be prepared to protect people from the vicious predators out there. And we have to be prepared to do that by using righteous violence to overcome those predators. Grossman's favorite metaphor is the sheepdog. Most of us are sheep. We just want to graze and live. But there are wolves behind every door. They're everywhere. And it's the sheepdogs that want to be there to keep us safe. There's a war going on, and police need to resort to violence to fight it. This is the warrior mindset. And I happened to be listening and reading last week, as many of you I know have been too, and I heard something that really struck me. There was an interview with a police officer from Savannah, Georgia. He was ex-CIA in the War on Terror, overseas and United States. His name was Patrick Skinner. And this is a quote from that interview. He said, that's exactly what police training does. Every situation is not just can be dangerous, but it will be dangerous because we're in a war on crime and anybody can kill you. Now, that sums it up better than I could right there. He also wrote a piece that appeared in one of the national newspapers. Here's a quote from it. I'll just take the last piece. What our society finds so distressing in police interactions, disrespect, anger, frustration, and violence is not a result of flawed training. It's a result of training for war. That is the root of the problem. And then, so what this training does, what this acculturation does, is it amps up the fear and it gives you a way to face it by using violence, right? And this is amped up through the use of videos of police officers being murdered and all kinds of other things. That's the presence of fear in police training and culture. Now, what about the other side? What about the civilian side? Well, I'll go to Nicole Hannah-Jones here. She just won a Pulitzer for her work on the 1619 Project. She is quite a writer. A lot of what I read in preparing to write my book, I read a lot of her work, and some of it has really stuck with me. And here's one that is in the book, and I'll just never forget. It's possible this will come, she's saying this to white people, as a surprise to you, but to a very real extent, you have grown up in a different country than I have. What does that mean? Are you confused? She doesn't mean different national borders. She means a different reality. Black people, in their dealing with police, do not experience the same reality as white people. White people, you don't believe it? Ask some Black people, I would suggest, and you will hear this is why they don't call the police unless they absolutely have to. House is being broken in, call your brother, call your neighbor. Because if the police come, they could get thinking that I'm the danger and I could be in trouble, or they could pull guns on my kids, right? The world is just different given their experience day in, day out, generation after generation. And that instills a deeply held fear that white people simply don't get, I find, a lot of times. So you put all this together, the poison of race and the poison of fear, that is why we are where we are. And some of this has been actively promoted by some very, very virulent forces. Now, let me shift and ask, are there things that can be done? Yes, I believe there are things that can be done, and I'm going to take things from my book and from some other places, all of which have been tried and have succeeded to one degree or another, all of which have a basis in evidence-based policing, all right? And then I'll end up with a discussion on the issue that's pertinent right now, this idea of defunding the police. So what can we do? Number one, we must move from warrior policing to something else. And I would suggest guardian-based policing. Guardian-based policing has a vision of police where we take care of our neighbors and we protect and serve them as neighbors. And we are guardians, police officers, that is, of the public peace and tranquility. That's what we want our police to do, besides answering real emergencies, perhaps. We don't want them fighting a war. This isn't Iraq. This isn't a war, not a metaphorical war and not a real war. We must move from warrior to other styles of policing. It's being done. It's no accident that this was recommendation number 1 in President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. It's being tried, it's being done, it's succeeding, it can work. Next, transparency and accountability. These are crucial issues. These are crucial issues. These are not abstractions, okay? And for very real reasons, I have these Chicago references up on the screen. Chicago has had among the worst problems with police violence for the longest. And it's no accident that transparency and accountability have been wanting there just terribly for the longest period of time. But this is also a place of transformation and change on these issues, I want to tell you. And not just because there's a consent decree in place, which there is. But this man on the right side of the screen, his name is Jamie Calvin. He's a journalist and a human rights activist. And years ago, he started fighting in federal court for a federal court to declare that police disciplinary and misconduct records were public records. Public records. After 8 years, he lost in federal court and went to court in state court. And at long last, a state court in Illinois said, these are all public records. They all have to be public. And after some pushing and shoving and resisting, guess what? Every police misconduct record, every police disciplinary record in Illinois is public. It's all out there. It's in a database. You can search it today, and so can everybody else. If it can happen there, I want to say, it can happen anywhere. A new bill was passed in California to the same effect last year, 2019. All disciplinary records, public records. And transparency goes along with accountability. For too long, citizens have observed that police are not always held accountable for what they do when they make mistakes or commit misconduct. I don't say never, but because there's no transparency, we don't know. And too often, a person on the police force who really does not belong there, commits some really egregious kind of misconduct, is back on the job. And we all hear about it and we all see it on the streets. There simply must be real accountability. Real accountability takes not just good policy, it takes supervision inside the police department and then holding people's feet to the fire. If you don't do that, you get nowhere. Use of force law has to change. Okay, use of force law must change. Okay, use of force law, the sort of minimum standard is set out by our U.S. Supreme Court back in the 80s in a case called Graham versus Garner. Let's not get into the weeds. Let's just say the court said that the use of force by a police officer measured under the Fourth Amendment has to be measured under the standard of a reasonable, objective officer. Not what the civilian would do, not in hindsight. And we have to keep in mind all the time that police are in danger and are responding in split-second scenarios. That was what the Supreme Court said. And that's the instructions to judges on all the lower courts and that are given to all the jurors. That's the minimum standard. But states are starting to wake up to the fact that they can change that. What you're seeing on the screen is that in California, last year, a bill was passed. You see Governor Newsom signing it, AB 392. It changed that standard from objectively reasonable to reasonable and necessary. There is also a proposal in the legislature in Harrisburg, here in our very own state. It is crafted and sponsored by Representative Summer Lee of our own county and other representatives from this area of the state. It's sitting in committee. So if anybody really wants to get things moving on this front, I've got a suggestion for you. But states are doing this. You're going to see these popping up everywhere. And on the federal side, we had a new piece of legislation introduced on Monday, the Justice and Policing Act of 2020. There will be significant use of force changes if the bill passes in its current form. We all know the sausage factory has a way of changing things, so we don't know what will be in it ultimately, but use of force law must change. Now, use of force law is often thought of as looking backwards. It's judging an incident that already happened. So we can't be satisfied with this. It wouldn't be enough. It is, though, part of how police train going forward. So if the law changes and says you must consider de-escalation, you must consider other methods besides using lethal force first, police will be trained to do that going forward. What else? I suggest taking a hard look at decriminalization. And I don't just mean weed, all right? Yes, decriminalize weed, good idea, or legalize it altogether. The statistics on marijuana arrests are still wildly skewed by race, even now. But this isn't it, okay? What we need to do is take a hard look at why so many things are criminal and therefore require a police response, right? Think of all the things that really don't have to be criminal that are, all right? Example, yeah, selling loose, untaxed cigarettes. That's a misdemeanor in some New York statute book, but look what happened. This is one of the stills from the horrible video of Eric Garner in which he says, "I can't breathe," and is killed over loose, untaxed cigarettes. Why do we need the police doing that? Do they want to do that? And so many other things fit this description. Traffic offenses, by and large, except for parking, traffic offenses are criminal. Sure, DWI, reckless driving, I get that. But equipment violations, going 10 miles over the speed limit, that's a crime? Yes. Failure to use your turn signal? Yes. Expired licenses? Yes. Can't we do that some other way? Do we have to involve police? Sleeping in public areas, the criminalization of homelessness, crimes associated with drug addiction, possession of substances in an amount beyond weed, in an amount that would be for one's own use. Shouldn't we be thinking about other ways to handle those problems that would just scale down police involvement in so many things that frankly, I don't think they're that interested in. They just aren't. And we wouldn't have as much of a police presence. Now, you've no doubt heard this, defunding the police. And I put a question mark because I think many people really don't understand what it is. So let me start there. And the answer, very lawyer-like, it depends on who you ask, depends. But let's go here. For some people, defunding the police means absolutely abolition. Defunding them, in other words, to zero, zeroing them out and getting rid of police and no police at all, and the role of police being taken over by other people, community members or social workers or drug counselors or whatever. On the other hand, it can mean something a little less to one side. It can be, do you actually mean a big change in priorities and especially in budgetary expenditures? You all probably know the phrase, a budget is a moral document, right? What that means, of course, is, you show me where you spend your money, I'll show you what you actually care about, right? And so the idea is take that money that is being used to, enforce loose cigarette laws and whatever else, and put it into other things that the community actually wants and needs to heal itself, to become whole, to become thriving and prosperous. So let's have a discussion about that. Now, what this is often caught up in is the question, can you imagine having no police at all? And I understand that. I think a lot of people will be stuck on that point. And I've heard a lot of people interviewed about this in the last few days, as I'm sure you have. And the honest answer is nobody knows. Nobody knows what the answer is to that question. And I think, if you were asking me, I would still be able to think of some things that I want real police work for, real serious crimes, homicides, sex offenses, other things. Even if we think that a great job has not been done on those things in the past, we're still going to need some professional help. That's just my opinion. It is not shared by everybody. I can guarantee you that. But what is, I think, coming into focus is a consensus that we don't need police for mental health issues, for mental health crises. I mean, we have good training for police that can help them understand a mental health crisis, the CIT version of training. And some police in Pittsburgh have had that training. It's good, but we can't possibly train all 900 of the officers with that very extensive and expensive training in any kind of time that we would need it. So wouldn't it be so much better to have a flying squad of mental health workers who could come onto the scene, just like when we call 911 now? And there are organizations and municipal arrangements that are doing this in some American cities. And, you know, on that question of having no police, I mean, that may be very difficult for people who look like me to imagine, but just imagine that your experience with police was very, very different. That it was much more like the experiences of your Black friends and neighbors and colleagues. If your experience has been difficult, let's just be as gentle as we can. If your experience has included when you call the police show up pointing guns at you, you might feel differently about this, okay? I think the conversation to have now about this, and it's a very live issue, is to ask what kind of police and policing do you want in your communities, unless you really want none. And that's a legitimate discussion to have. And what else does the community need to thrive and be whole? That, I think, could get us a long way. And we have seen changes along that route. I'm going to end my formal remarks here, but I just want to say how grateful I am to the center, to John Wallace, to Jay Hughley, and everybody there for the chance to talk to you today. There's one thing that I haven't mentioned. It's not part of policy, and it's not part of evidence-based policing, but please put yourself in the other person's shoes. Think about how people different than you would experience police or state intervention in their lives if you can't quite put your arms around this. And I think you will see there are reasons that people are upset now. There are reasons that there are protests now, and there are reasons things must change. We cannot go on like this. We can't, we won't. We have the power to be different. We can see that now. I'm going to make it different. Thank you very, very much for allowing me to talk to you.
Mr. Harris, thank you so much for sharing. Very, very powerful. I'm sure I speak for our audience in saying that. I want to jump right into questions that we've received. So Catherine Twigg wanted to know about the role of police unions and asked, about police unions and are they an obstacle to reform? Part of that being maybe that they fail to represent the more diverse officers in policing. And then the second part of this question is about Camden, I presume New Jersey maybe, decision to disband their police force and reform with the county. So the union role, and then I don't know if you know about the Camden case.
Yes, I do. Let me take the union piece first. These are both great questions. Unions in some places have been real obstacles to change. I'm not against unions, not in any way. I believe in the right to organize, collective bargain for better wages, better working conditions and benefits. But in too many cities, what we see is that cities, instead of giving raises or instead of giving benefits, instead they have traded off pieces of the disciplinary process to the union. They have made it much more difficult to administer discipline, to do investigations when there's misconduct. And this is a big reason why through arbitration, we get officers back who really shouldn't be on the job. I realize unions want to protect their members, but they do themselves no favors when they go out of their way to save the people that everybody in the department knows does not belong in that job. And I've been in police departments, I've talked to them, I've worked with them. They know who those people are. It's like any other organization, 5% of your people cause 90% of your problems. And union collective bargaining contracts sometimes make it much more difficult to get rid of people who should be gone. Make no mistake. I won't point to every union. I won't point to every police department. But you go to a conference like I do of police chiefs, and I speak to them. And then there's a time where I'll go in the bar for a while, have a beer, a drink or something. And you sit at their tables and every one of them is talking about, I fired that guy for X and I got him back. And the next person says, well, I fired a guy for Y and I got him back. I mean, this is just ubiquitous. This has to change. This has to change. Camden is a great example of a city that just got to the point of we cannot deal with the troubled police department we have in Camden, New Jersey, and we're starting over. They effectively blew it up. And then they went to a new structure based on officers from their county. They had that discussion about what kind of police do we want? What kind of policing do we want? And they definitely didn't want what they had. And they completely reconstituted their department. And they have something much, much better. It's not trouble-free. It's not perfect. Nothing human is. But I would highly recommend finding things to read about what happened in Camden. It was a real transformation. And it's not alone either.
Let me ask a follow-up question, because I was on a panel with the union president in Pittsburgh, and you may have seen also there was a letter that's been in the media this week from the vice president of the union, and part of their position in response to the protests and police engagement has been that they've already put in the reforms that people are recommending, in that they're ahead of the curve in this way, and different people disagree. How do we prevent sort of a rubber stamping or reforms without teeth? How do we have real accountability, built into these reforms as people start to implement them?
Another great question. I haven't seen that letter, so I can't respond directly to it. But what I can say is that some of the reforms mentioned in 8 Can't Wait, I'm sure a lot of people have seen that, have been put in place in Pittsburgh. But part of our transparency issue is that we don't know. Lots of people are uninformed or have not paid attention, maybe until now. If you want to make sure that the reforms you want stay in place and bite, you have to stay on this. You can't just pay attention when something terrible happens. I mean, we all know about Antoine Rose last year, here or 2 years ago, right in our own area, and what happened in the aftermath of that case. Maybe it was last year. I'm sort of losing track. As we say his name too, we have to remember that all we saw in the aftermath there was that police department, that little police department is now out of existence. But if we want to see real change in our region, we have to stay on top of this. And you cannot let it out of your sight. You have to keep going to meetings. You have to keep the political pressure up on political actors because they respond to it.
David, I have a question. What does Guardian training look like versus the warrior training you described?
Guardian training, the full description, I'm going to reference the 21st Century Policing Task Force report. It's well described there, better than I can do in a few seconds. But what it comes to is an entirely different mental attitude, in the sense that we aren't here to fight a war. We're here to actually serve and help. The people here are not our adversaries. They're the people we're here to serve. And with that, you get all kinds of differences in action. You get de-escalation. You get responsibility for calling out other officers engaging in misconduct, the so-called EPIC training that has been done to great success in the state of Washington, in New Orleans. But I'd really recommend for a full picture going to that report because it lays out the steps and the actual, what you see different in training and what's expected of officers. Officers are, it's not all about how many arrests you make anymore. It's about what kind of liaison and connection you're making with the community, how you help them solve a problem before it becomes a series of crimes. So there's a lot to it. I can't do it justice in 30 seconds, but it's some of those things.
Yeah, but what do you see as the barriers of that happening?
The barriers are first and foremost the inculcation of warrior thinking and training in the existing forces that we have. And that goes along with something you probably have heard described as the sort of the us and them way of thinking in police. I mean, this has been common for so long. You talk to police, you know, it's not a racial thing, it's a blue thing. It's us against everybody. Nobody understands what we do. People can't really grasp the level of responsibility we have when we put that uniform on and wear that badge. You have no business talking to us about how to do our jobs unless you really have done it. And that kind of attitude is the biggest barrier there is. There are plenty of people in policing who would like to see it different, but as long as that's there, what has to happen is leadership at the top of these organizations has to insist on it. And this is what's happening in Washington State, for instance. Mm-hmm. And when it's not followed, there must be accountability. There must be accountability. And that's been a missing piece for too long.
Thank you.
We have a question from Jamie Espinal, Richmond, Virginia, and he wants to know about what people are saying as far as the media exacerbating this issue. What do you say to those who believe the policing problem is being exacerbated by the media and share statistics where a small amount out of the millions of Black people in America are being affected by this? What have you encountered that argument, and what have you said?
I don't think it's just the media. I honestly don't. I do think that the media in general focuses on conflict. That's just a fact. And they would be focusing on conflict, whether we're arguing about, do we have to stay locked up under COVID or wear masks, or do we not? They focused on that conflict. They're focusing on this one. That isn't wrong of them to do. That's what they do. Though it would be good to see them dive deeper on some things than just who said what. I have been watching and working with the statistics on these problems from multiple sources for many years. I have made it my business in my research to talk to individual Black people of all levels of society, to interview them, to get their point of view, to read their work. It is not exaggerated. It is not. I mean, anybody who believes that is not really absorbing what is going on to others, right? And I realize that that's difficult. The media, always focuses on the terrible case, the one thing, and so forth. But there's so much more to the world. If you have relationships with people who are different than you, you understand that your experience may not be theirs. And, I've seen it. I know other people have seen it. And it isn't just my own experiences and beliefs and the beliefs and experiences of people I know. The numbers are indisputable when you talk about use of force, when you talk about the way that police deal with African Americans and other people of color, and the way that they do or don't respect them. The evidence is there. It's not a question of the evidence. It's a question of what we want to do to react to it.
Yeah, and if I can just weigh in on that a little bit, I feel like it's inhumane and hypocritical to say that. I think in the Black community, we all, either directly or indirectly through people, know people have had very scary run-ins. There's not a very wide degree of separation on a personal level. And, we have insurance for things in our lives. We have life insurance, we have home insurance. I live on the top of a hill. I have flood insurance. Chances of my house flooding are very, very small. People think that's a realistic fear to have, but it's not realistic to have fear of a violent encounter with law enforcement when you know people who have had that. I think that's hypocritical in reflection of what you say. People do not have a personal contact with people they know that have been through it.
Happy to take other questions.
I'll jump back in one here. Can you say a little bit more about the 8 can't wait policy? I'm not sure everyone's familiar with that. This question from Robert Wilson.
Yeah, 8 can't wait. I don't have it up on my screen. I wish I did, but it's a number of policies that I think are easy to get your arms around, that you could advocate for in your own hometown, things that are about transparency and about accountability. These are things that I think anybody can get behind. And one of the interesting, telling things about this is when this first came out, I think it was after former President Obama spoke last week, that started to really trend everywhere. And our local officials, both the mayor and the police, came out. The mayor straight up said, I'm in favor of this. Chief Schubert, if I recall correctly, said, we're doing most of this already. What you want to do is get the information and find out, and what about those other ones and so forth. Let's talk about it, because we want to discuss what kind of policing we want to have. But I don't see these 8 things, and I wish I had them up on my screen for you, as really that controversial. These are improvements we can make now.
David, go ahead, Jay, you were in the middle of the statement. So what can we do as citizens, as academics? How can we change this situation?
Well, we want to stay focused on what we each can do individually, what's within our power. I mean, I have certain issues that don't allow me to go out and be in the middle of the protest, even if I want like to. So I can do this. I can write letters. I can sit down with my state reps. I can get people's attention that way. But as citizens, we all have to find what's in our power to do and do it, and keep doing it until we get the kind of action that we seek. I cannot say more strongly that it is important to vote. I mean, we must vote for people who will do these things. I mean, one of the things that was interesting about the action in Minneapolis just this past Sunday, when members of the city council came out and announced that they were going to completely defund their police department. Something new was going to be put in its place. That was a long-term demand from some people in the community, but notice it's 9 elected representatives. So if it happens, and we all know there's many's a slip between the cup and the lip, but if it happens, it's going to be a political moment by duly elected people. It is very much like what we see in a lot of other cities, in which you have district attorneys that have a much different attitude toward the criminal justice system and new policies that are reflective of what the community wants. I'd point to Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. I would point to Rachel Rollins in Boston. I'd point to Kim Fox in Chicago. All these people were elected because the community demanded it. They found a person who would do it, and they voted that person in. That is real power to get things done. So John, the gamut of possibilities is open for everybody, but it begins with this sort of democratic accountability. We have to assure that our voices are heard and that they are not ignored.
David, I'm gonna trouble you with one more question. It's come up from a few different listeners, and I think you've covered parts of this as you've talked. But policing themselves, what does an effective accountability system look like? Many people have said it's not enough to leave police to police themselves.
Yes, this goes back to I think it's Roman times. Who will guard the guardians, right? I think even if we believe that our own individual police department is very good and very upright, we would all feel a little bit like, they're deciding what they did wrong. We all know that in any profession, the people being supervised need to be supervised by somebody else. I said it about my profession too, right? And the idea that police should be in charge entirely of police discipline is just out of date. I realize that it's not loved within law enforcement circles, but there basically has to be civilian oversight. It can take many forms. We have a very robust Citizens Police Review Board here in Pittsburgh that many of you probably know about, that was democratically created by our voters here. There are many other such organizations in other cities. It can be an ombudsman, it can be a monitor or an auditor, but there has to be somebody looking over police misconduct. That's the way to true accountability. If you're a police agency or a police executive and you want true public confidence, you would want this, I contend, because that's what will get the public to believe that the results of an investigation of misconduct were not fixed somehow. Were not done by you for your own people. That's the only way to go.
All right. Well, David, thank you very much. We really appreciate everything you've shared, incredible information. And I think it gives us some concrete steps also that we can take to move forward. I want to thank everyone for attending our Chriscast, and I want you to stay tuned for future events that we're going to have. And, trying to get my screen share up. You can obviously contact Professor Harris either on his social media. He's got a great podcast and the book title that is out and available. Please follow us on our website. This will be recorded. You can look there. We have a large archive of talks, and actually Professor Harris has 2 other great talks on our archive already. He's been at this for a long time, talking about stop and frisk going back to the early 2000s. So he's a real one on these topics. So thank you for coming out. We look forward to talking to you in the near future as these events unfold. So
Thank you for the opportunity, Doctor. I appreciate it.
absolutely. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, David.
My pleasure.